we continue our mini-series on petunia production, we're moving into one of my absolute favorites. That's wave petunias. Wave petunias are absolutely one of the greatest garden plants ever created, in my opinion. And I'm glad that you're back to continue this petunia mini-series and talk about wave, because they do have so many amazing benefits for consumers, home gardeners, landscapers, just about everyone who likes garden plants. And I know that throughout the years, PanAmerican has put a ton of breeding into these programs. It's ongoing breeding with new series. It seems like released every 5 or 6 years. And with some of the newest on the market now being the E3s. But why are we breaking out wave petunias on their own? And because I know that you covered a lot of the basics on petunias in our last video, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But why are we specifically looking at wave this time?
Well, we want to look at wave because it truly is a completely different beast. It's similar because it still is a petunia at the end of the day. So a lot of the things that we talked about in the common petunia, the everyday petunia, from a nutrition and standpoint, is exactly the same in wave as it is in the wave series as it is in common petunias. But there is a lot of very specific information that PanAmerican Seed has developed on photoperiod responsiveness, growth regulators, when it initiates. There's just a lot of more detailed so that you can more custom produce this product than you can a lot of other types of spreading petunias. So the beauty of going and sticking with the wave series is that there is data supporting how you can achieve the best possible crop. And this was early on because, Bill, you're such a youngster, having only been around for 20 years. I've been around when wave first came in. The purple wave was pretty easy because it was just one. But then as you started breeding these, you ended up with a lot more complexity because of the nuances of this variety versus that variety. And so PanAmerican Seed has, of course, continued to evolve and breed and try to simplify the production of these crops with, of course, initially introducing Easy Wave. And then for those people that wanted really a big plant, they went with Tidal Wave so that it get kind of a background. And, as I've traveled around the world, like in Korea, they use it extensively, Tidal Wave, in decorating bridges. So they've got plantings, planting boxes hung on the bridges. And then, of course, the tidal wave grows huge. The wave, purple wave, then cascades. So it's really excellent. But, of course, those two are, wave and tidal wave are kind of difficult to manage in a pack and small pot. Mm-hmm. So then you've got Easy Wave, which works that way, but it's kind of uneven. A couple of colors are a little bit different, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But really, it's the E3s that are the true innovation, even though all the waves are basically revolutionary in the petunia world. But E3, Easy Wave, is probably the series that gives you the most uniform performance. So let's talk about petunias and definitely look at the previous common petunias for some of it, because we're really going to just try to focus on what's different about the wave family. So we always have to talk about this because it is really one of the big problems that growers run into, especially with wave, is that you've got to make sure that you don't root bound the plug. So if you've got these roots winding around at the top, that means that you're probably holding them or that they weren't going through wet dry. And you don't want to have this root binding because the roots then just don't grow out. So you really want the picture on the right, which is you got this root mass all over with a lot of roots at the bottom, and notice the little root tips there, which will root out much faster. So holding temperatures, again, these are cold-blooded plants so that you can basically hold them at cool temperatures, at basically 40, 55 degrees if you want to, which is probably appropriate late in the season if they're induced. But we're going to talk a little bit about this whole floral induction problem, because to get rapid flowering, you really want to make sure that they're induced at the time of planting or shortly thereafter. And it's much easier to heat up a small area to hold the plugs and or to than to try to go and heat a large greenhouse. Also, it's in the case of wave, because flowering occurs at a little bit later stage than it does in normal petunias. You want to be using a 288 or larger plug for more rapid flowering, especially early in the season. So if you want to use like a 512 late in the season, when the day lengths are long and also the night temperatures are up, that'll work. But early in the season, if you need to get fast turning, you got to have a 288 and you've got to make sure that they're induced. And so if you've got plants that you basically do the leaf count on, notice that I've counted the leaves for you on this particular plug, and you notice that the leaf 7 is coming out at you, leaf 8 is going backwards or horizontal. You want to make sure that those leaves are basically are flat, and not going straight up, because those don't count. You need to have 8 or more leaves. And so if you get 9 leaves, that's better. 10, now you're starting to get a bit long. But to achieve that, you have to have higher night temperatures. So to get those leaves unfolded at 65 plus, and you want to make sure that you've got 10 plus hours of photoperiod so that they will induce rapidly, especially early in the season. If we got a good example here of easy wave, now the difference is that purple wave and the pure waves, flower on the lateral shoot, meaning that primary shoot that comes straight up, which is where most petunias flower. Easy waves that's the innovation with easy wave and E3 wave, is that the flowering is basically on the primary shoot, so they flower more rapidly. Conversely, on the original wave, it doesn't have a terminal flower, so that the lateral branches that come out have to unfold a certain number of leaves before they are induced to flower. So it's really important that you understand this subtle difference if you're growing wave or tidal wave versus using easy wave or E3 easy wave, because of where the plants are induced to flower. So that you really have to use that little bit larger plug to make sure that you're getting the branching on the original wave so that you can get early flowering and induction, whereas in the easy wave, you just want to make sure that you've got enough leaves unfolded and it'll happen. So does that make sense, Bill, that there's this slight difference that you have to be aware of?
Yeah, and I've never heard it explained that way. I mean, I knew there was a difference clearly between easy wave and original wave, but that was about as clear as I've ever heard it explained.
Yeah, and you can actually see it if you go look at them. And time and again, when early on, probably about 20 years ago when you came in, we started seeing this as there are more and more varieties coming in of the wave family, the subtle differences in why some people were successful with easy wave versus other people were struggling with easy wave. They ran them too cold, or they didn't get as early flowering with the regular original wave as they did with easy wave. And of course, that is just where the flowers originate from. So keep that in mind, because that's going to really help you understand how should I handle these plants before I get them transplanted or immediately after. Now, always water these plugs in before planting. Using 20-10-20 will promote rapid leaf growth, and it's really important with the original waves where you've got to get those laterals. And the beauty of the wave family, all of them, is that they laterally branch rapidly and fill out that cascading appearance. And to achieve that, you got to get that ammonia and phosphorus that you get from 20-10-20. If you're planting them immediately after you receive them, make sure that you water them in with 200 parts per million of 20-10-20. If you're basically going to have to hold them for a while with no fertilizer, then you better give them a little bit heavier feed, like 300 parts per million, to get them to branch out more successfully once you get them transplanted. If you're holding them, which I don't recommend, especially if you're holding them for too long, or if you're trying to get them induced because the plants are quite induced, make sure that you're feeding them with everywhere from 50, 75, or even a little bit higher of fertilizer to prevent stress and the stopping of growth. And then make sure that, again, that you put that 200 parts per million on at the time of planting, because as we see in this example with begonias that Bill Argo did, but he's also done it in a number of other crops, you see a benefit by pre-plant that basically continues all the way through the crop. You don't even have to feed as much later on. So you can use a wide range of containers for the wave family. So how big do you want this plant? Do you need them really fast because you're growing them in packs, or can you use them in larger pots and you basically want to bulk them up a little bit? So you need to kind of keep that in mind when you decide how I'm going to feed them. So the crop time of the wave is basically a little bit longer than you see with regular petunias, and that just has to do with how the flowers are expressed. Are they on the primary or secondary? These are easy wave crop times, and of course, the original wave is going to be longer, just because you have to unfold those lateral shoots after you transplant. So, kind of refer to the PanAmerican Seed guidelines as far as crop times for these different, and that's really easily available on the web. We have to make sure we always look at the container that we're using for these petunias, and making sure that you've got adequate peat in that soil for water holding capacity and also nutrient holding capacity. Remember, these are very hungry, loving plants. They like a lot of feed to get those branching, get the leaf expansion, and get that to bulk up and really take off for the consumer. So if you have too many bulking agents in there, if it exceeds the 30%, whether you're looking at wood fiber or rice hulls or coconut fiber or composted wood, you basically have to be very careful that the water holding and feed might not be adequate, and you have to maybe feed more. Test before you plant. You want to make sure that that pH is not too high, because that will affect a number of problems with micronutrient availability. Make sure that pH is 5 to 6 before planting, and then about a week later, it should come up. You can make sure that there's an EC of 1 to 1.5, so that you've got a charge. Every year we get pictures sent in. What's the matter with your plugs? Well, it's not really a matter of what's the matter with your plugs. It's what soil did you use? Did you use old soil? You had that old soil from last year that you're using, or God forbid, even longer, basically doesn't have the starter charge in it. It might not have adequate wetting agent in it, and therefore the plants just don't take off and root out into that soil as rapidly as if you're using new soil. So if you see this kind of situation where all the plants were planted at the same time, they came out of the same plug trays, and you end up with some that take off and grow and some of them that just sit there and stare at you, really go back and look at what is that soil and check that soil to see, was it old soil? Did it have a starter charge? Did it have a wetting agent? Now, let's talk about building the plant, and with the difference between the common petunia that you use for an entry-level price point versus wave, which is a higher price point and has better garden performance, is you really have to think about building the plant. This is really critical to get a success. Now, consumers are looking at the tops. They're looking at, what does the foliage look like? Are there enough branches? Is it full? Are there nice flowers? And that's what customers are buying. And to achieve that, the growers have to have roots. I can't stress enough that it's really a root system gives you the control to basically manipulate the top using fertilizer, growth regulators for the foliage and flowers. And basically, if you manage the moisture, you can get the root system that will allow you to get the crop to dance the way you want it to. Now, we can never stress enough that fish grow in water and roots grow in air. And time and again, we've got growers that have either saturated that soil and the plants just don't grow. It delays. In fact, sometimes in some crops, you can get a delay of 1 to 2 weeks by just keeping the plants too wet. So what do we talk about when it's too wet? When we talk about the plants are constantly wet, so you're watering all the time and you're maintaining a level 4 plus. What is a level 4? A level 4 means that the plants are dripping. If you've got water underneath your benches, you might be putting on a little bit too much water. So really look at that carefully as you're walking through the greenhouse. When you pick the plants up, is there water dripping out of the bottom of the pots, an hour or so after you've watered, or even after as you're watering, or are they basically dry? Pull the plants out of the pot and take a look at them. Do you have roots at the bottom? Seeing that wave series, the wave family, you're tending to grow in larger containers, which tend to waterlog because they basically can hold more water. So it's really easy to put too much water on the waves, and you basically end up with stretched, soft growth, and the plants are just out of control unless you put a lot of growth regulators on. If you basically run them way too dry, there are some growers in this world, not a lot, but there are some that will let them hit the ground, as they say, like them dry. That's not good, because that's going to stunt them, and it basically could end up with some premature flowering if they induce, and you get really small little flowers. Now, every so often you get these pictures sent in where growers have basically wilted down the plants badly. And of course, there's one of two reasons why they've gotten to this point. One is they forgot to water the plugs in before they planted them. And of course, if you take a dry plug and you put it into a soil and you end up with an air gap between the soil that's in the pot and that plug or liner, they can't take up the water. They can't move it across this air gap. So to avoid the air gap, one of the things that we talk about is is using your water tunnels, but just turn those nozzles about 45 degrees so that as the pots go underneath that water tunnel, some water is spraying from one angle, it's coming down, it's coming from two different angles, from forward and back, to kind of firm that soil up against it and making sure that you've got enough water coming into contact with that root ball. Because so many times you get to this state where you've dried out that root ball, it's really hard to get it going again because the roots are dead. So once we got those plants planted, let's talk about water management. One of the things that we want to talk about is making sure that we've got water to moisten below the plug. So if you've got a really large container, so you're looking at 5-6 plus inch baskets where you've got a lot of soil in that pot, make sure that you put enough water to get it below the plugs, but you don't have to go and saturate it so they go dripping out like Niagara Falls. That's a bad plan, especially at that first watering. You want to basically get that first water down so that you have a level 3 or level 4 at the bottom of the container, so that the roots basically race down. They're looking for water. The top will dry out and they'll root to the bottom. When we look at the 5 levels of moisture, level 5 through level 1, what we see really clearly is that when you maintain them at a level 5 or level 4, you just don't end up with anywhere near the root system that you will have when you have levels 2 and level 3 that you dry them down to and then water them back up. So especially initially, this is what's really critical. You need to get those roots to the bottom of the container so that you can remove that perched water table, which is the free water that forms at the bottom of the container due to gravity. So if you keep it too dry, you just don't get the root system either. So you want to make sure that you're in that level 2 or 3 is where you want to be. We talked about the pre-plant in those first couple of weeks as your fertilizer, which is more than sufficient. Remember, if you have slow leaf expansion, feed with additional ammonia and phosphorus, especially if you're not getting the branching that you're looking for, because that will promote leaf expansion and lateral branching. If you have excess leaf expansion, so that they're just big leafy, you wonder, am I growing petunias or am I growing lettuce? Well, then you basically need to make sure that you back off the feed, either the rate or the frequency after transplant, because you're just putting on too much feed. If you have to feed, it's always better to feed at a lower rate more frequently, say 75, 100, 150 parts per million, plus your micronutrients, so that you are able to achieve the growth that you're trying to have. If you're basically at the time of shipping, we always like to have you feed them with 150 to 200 parts per million. Why? Is because wave tends to use a lot of feed. It's a big, bulky plant. The wave family likes to be well fed. And so consequently, if you basically don't feed them in the week before planting or shipping, and then you ship them off to a garden center where they sit there for up to a week, what happens is they just run hungry and they turn yellow. And of course, consumers see those as unhealthy plants. So if you put feed on them before you ship them, then they're going to at least be able to carry through the retail experience and then on to the consumer, who then will be more successful. So really, I can't stress this enough for wave. Make sure that you feed your plants before you ship them so that those plants have the best performance both at retail and subsequently for the consumer. Let's just talk about our fertilizer a little bit, because I think a lot of times we don't really realize it's just not a bag. It makes a big difference. Check your water. Water test once a year, absolutely critical. You would never go and jump into a shower without checking the water. Why are you putting your livelihood into water you don't know anything about? You need to make sure you know what your water is. What is the alkalinity? Is it 100, 200 parts per million? That's a real sweet spot that you can work with. And if it's higher, you may have to use acid. If it's lower, you need to approach it from a different strategy. Look at what's in that water. Not all water is exactly the same, depending upon you're using pond water or deep well or shallow well or even river water or city water. It changes dramatically of what's in there, and the pH and the EC, and also what are the micronutrients or macronutrients. Look at what is the soil after you've watered several times. Are you getting to that 5.8 to 6.2, which is kind of where you want? That means your limestone is activated. That means that everything is ready to go. When we start feeding, and especially in the early, feeding early is better because that gives the plant the chance to take it up, move it into those lower, older foliage, and then basically as the plant now starts to push, it can translocate it throughout the whole plant. And so early feeding is really important. So feeding constantly early on with maybe 150 parts per million or less, make sure that if you've got very high percent ammonia, you're going to have soft growth. So maybe that's desirable. Maybe it's not. You have to decide under your own conditions. Using ammonium plus phosphorus to get stretch and branching is really important to be considering, especially if you're using wave versus easy wave versus E3. Really look at, how can we fine tune what fertilizer we're using and how much we're applying. Using 20-10-20 versus 17-5-17, let's take a look at what the difference is. One of the things that we know is that if you're using a lot of a high ammonia and high phosphorus feed, basically that tends to push the pH down in the soil. If you're using a high nitrate, low phosphorus feed, that tends to help move the pH up. So if we take a look at a bunch of different fertilizer formulations, and every fertilizer formulation is slightly different, so you have to look at it. We're looking at what is the ammonia percent and the amount of parts per million phosphorus. And we're looking at a target of right around 20 or less percent ammonia. And as you can quickly see, 20-20-20 has a very high amount of the nitrogen is in the ammoniacal form. So 74% of it is in the ammoniacal form. But more critically, you've got 65 parts per million phosphorus. When you're really looking at 10 to 15 parts per million is a good place to be. So you're giving it a really big shot of both ammonia and on phosphorus. If you look all the way to the right and you look at 13-2-13, basically you've got very low, because it's mainly nitrate, amount of phosphorus and very low ammonia. So you basically can use your fertilizer to give you that push with ammonia phosphorus, or you can basically tone it back down. One of the things that's really critical with petunias, because you see this tip abortion where you get this abnormal growth, and that's all boron deficiency. It's really a problem early in the season when you have dark, dreary weather, overcast. You don't have a lot of airflow because it's cold, and so it's very humid, and boron moves in the water stream. And so if you're not moving water, if they're not drying out and getting wet, they're not moving boron. If they're not moving boron, you're going to end up potentially with tip abortion. We like to have about a 0.5 part per million of boron in this water when we're applying it. And notice that all of these fertilizers are formulated with little or no boron in them. So if you have had this problem of tip abortion with boron, it induced due to your environment, you basically should add some additional boron to that fertilizer to get around this. And it could be a problem with some of the waves. Let's talk about light and photoperiod. Now, the light quality is important when you're looking at induction. If you're using LED lights, you want to make sure that you have the right balance of red and far red and blue. Blue tends to keep your plants more compact, and same with red, but it's really important to have far red in your light source for induction. So if you're using LEDs in your holding area prior to transplant, make sure that you've got some far red light in there so that when they have reached the mature stage, so the juvenility is over, they will be induced. Otherwise, you're just basically not going to induce. Remember, petunias are thermophotoperiodic, which means that they basically respond to temperature and photoperiod. You kind of have the right combination. The flowers on, of course, we talked about this, they're lateral, and that means that they come out of the axil of the leaf and there's still a growing point. And that doesn't make any difference whether you're talking about wave, where it's on the side shoots, so it's on the lateral of the side shoots, or if it's on easy wave or E3 wave, easy wave, where it's on the primary shoot. Remember that juvenile leaf count is really critical, 8+ leaves, which is 2 more leaves than the others. If the lower light conditions, so if you've got less than 12 DLI, what the problem you run into is that you need that you need more leaves. And there's a couple of varieties that are more sensitive to this than others. So remember, temperatures in photoperiod interact. So if we take a look at this table, which shows that if the plants are juvenile, which means that they're less than 8 leaves, and the photoperiod is 10 plus hours, so it's a long day, and the temperatures are up, they're still going to be vegetative because they're just not ready to initiate flowers. Once you have mature plants, which are basically they've unfolded that 8 plus leaves, and if your photoperiod is less than 10 hours and it's below 65-degree night temperatures, you're going to be vegetative. So you're going to continue to delay flower initiation and eventual sale. If you've got the mature plant, but you've got long days, awesome, but you're not growing them warm enough, guess what? They're going to stay vegetative. And this is one of the problems that we see early in the season where people grow with small plugs, 512s, which just don't have the leaf count, versus 288s. You got a couple more leaves on a 288 than a 512, and early in the season, it's just you're not going to get warm enough at night, and the daylilies are going to be, and they're going to just be vegetative. Later in the season, they have no problem. So and the why there is because the plants basically are exposed to long days, and they have warmer night temperatures, and so that they basically will flower. So this is where you really have to understand when you're planting and what the photoperiods are and what the temperatures are. And and so we talk about this as a facultative long day plant that basically is thermophotoperiodic. So PanAm has done a lot of really nice work working with Michigan State and also with their own internal research, where they basically have got all of these tables where they group the different varieties into different groups from responsiveness to photoperiod. And then also some suggestions on when at different latitudes, know where you are in the world, and what you should be lighting or natural day, which is a really nice tool for you to use. Now let's talk a little bit about photoperiod and temperature. Remember that the average daily temperature is really important, and that these are cold-blooded. So if you basically, once they're induced and you want to hold the plants, dropping them down to 40-degree night temperatures is awesome. So a lot of people will move them outside because then they'll have very cold night temperatures. Growth stops. They are what they are. They're not moving. That's what it means by a base temperature. And what we see is that the temperature drops. If you need to keep them moving, basically up the soil temperature if you can. So warm soils, because that's where the growing point is essential for rapid root growth and rapid development. Air temperatures of 68 to 70. And as we see, there's a very strong interaction between crop time and flowering. So PanAm has a great Wave Smart schedule on there. And if you go on to the Michigan State Eric Runkle's page, he's also got some tools that he's developed over the years for different varieties and how they different perform. Now, controlling stretch is really important, that with the waves that you go and see what is their vigor rating. And a PanAm has rated all of the different varieties by vigor. So the more vigorous, the more growth regulator if you want to control this growth, or and if they're more moderate or if they're more compact, you want to basically cut the growth regulator back. So it really gives you that tool to fine tune it, and that's all available on the PanAm. Remember that fertilizer does control the vigor. So if you feed them a lot, you're going to get a lot of growth, and if you got a vigorous variety, well, you better step on them with growth regulators. Remember that high ammonia plus phosphorus, you get leaf and stem expansion. Going to nitrates, it kind of tones them back down. Remember, using diff as your first line of control and using a basically a high-low thermometer if you don't have an environmental controller is a great tool. Now, with growth regulators, make sure you get them on to early to control that stretch. If you have a moderate and tidy varieties, early on, dimetazide, chlormequat alone or in combination plus N-cibidol is a great strategy to use. If you've got vigorous and late in the season, then you want to basically be going after baclobutazol and uniconazole to hold them under control. Remember that with all of these growth regulators, it takes about 3 to 5 days between the time you apply them and the plant actually ceases stretch. You can't decide they're too big and then spray them and expect them to get smaller. There's no chemical that will fix that. You got to get it on ahead of time. So a little bit early and then allow them to grow out of it is better than trying to slam them down. Now, if you have early control with sprays, awesome. It'll kind of tone them back down. But later on, as you reach that point where the plants are growing very, very rapidly and you start seeing them approach 90% of the allowable final size, you need to be in there with your paclobutazole drench. And also take a look at what are your insect and disease issues and look under and over the benches, because thrips basically hide out in the greenhouse, overwintering in the ground. Same with fungus gnats and shorefly larvae. And basically, if you don't manage the floors, you're not going to manage the insects later in the season. Mites can be a problem coming in from other crops that you have, especially if you've got foliage plants. You might be hitchhiking some plants in there, so watch what's going on there. Make sure that you've got the caterpillars under control, so screening for moths, because you can get some pretty awesome ones in there. Aphids are drop-in. Botrytis risk is your number one risk factor. Looking at reduced relative humidity, good airflow, especially if you use a lot of hanging baskets. Remember, these are very big, bulky plants, so you really have to make sure that you've got them wet and dry cycles to prevent good drain airflow and basically reducing the relative humidity at night. Watch out for crown rots, because remember, and these are also very dense, and you can get some stuff in there. Phalabiopsis, of course, is a disease that you can run into. And it comes out of the floors, and you've got to really watch your fungus gnats and shoreflies, which are vectoring the disease from the floor up into the pots that you're growing. Also look for leaf spots. If you get a lot of leaf spots, you've got a nutrition issue. So, Bill, are there some other sources that we can get additional information, more detailed information on rates, etc.?
There are. And I also want to mention, and you mentioned the amazing resources from our friends at PanAmerican. I will put links to as many of those as possible in the show notes, from the smart scheduling tool to the flower timing to picking the right series for what you want to achieve in terms of an end result. So, huge shout out to Pan Am for all the research they continue to do on Wave. I love that it's a series that's been it's a collection of series that have been around for a long time, but the breeding is ongoing and certainly still a flagship product. And like you mentioned, we do have great resources at Grower Talks, the grower guides that can be found at growertalks.com/grower guides, covering insecticides, miticides, and fungicides, the biosolutions guide, which we publish every year, that highlights biocontrols that are certainly amazing options in any greenhouse, and then the PGR guide for annuals, which sounds like you might need on your waves earlier than later. Then, in addition to the grower guides, you can find hundreds of tech on demand educational resources online. Every week, I send a newsletter covering a range of technical and cultural topics. We've created hundreds of videos for greenhouse professionals of all skill levels. We have a podcast. In fact, you probably listen to some of these presentations on our podcast. It's a great way to learn about technical topics on the go. And if you want to connect with a massive group globally of greenhouse professionals, I suggest you join the Greenhouse Tech Team Facebook group. All you got to do is search Greenhouse Tech Team, answer a couple questions, and I will let you right in. But Will, once again, thank you so much. I know you have helped growers with Wave for many, many years, and like me, you love all the different series and see the benefits and what growers can do to produce these successfully, because we know that shoppers buy them, right?
Absolutely.
So this is great. We are going to be back with the third part of our mini series on vegetative petunia production. We will be back very shortly. I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand on behalf of our entire team and the team at PanAmerican Seed. Thanks for listening and watching. Take care out there.